Welcome back to Shadowed Pages, my dear friends. I'm Edward, and I'm truly delighted to have you join me once again this evening. Where are you tuning in from today, and how has your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, let's begin. The evening air at the Garden Society Ball was crisp, with the scent of fresh-cut flowers mingling with the faint, warm fragrance of the nearby bonfire. Guests in elegant gowns and tailored tuxedos drifted through the open garden gates, their laughter and chatter a gentle hum under the soft glow of lanterns hanging from the trees. It was an event that had become a highlight of the year, bringing together the crème de la crème of the village, all eager to escape the mundane and revel in the extravagance of the season. Yet, beneath the polished smiles and sparkling jewels, there was a tension in the air that Miss Marple, ever perceptive, could not quite shake off. As she made her way through the bustling crowd, she noted the usual faces. Lady Hargrove, with her sharp, calculating eyes that never missed a thing. Mr. Fenwick, the village solicitor, whose tongue was as quick as his wit, and Mrs. Smythe, the matriarch of the largest estate in the area, who had an uncanny knack for knowing the secrets of everyone within a mile radius. All were present, as expected. But then, her eyes caught someone she hadn't anticipated. Detective Inspector Hughes, who stood by the flower arrangements, looking ever so out of place in his sober black suit. She knew of Hughes from the many times his investigations had crossed paths with her own musings on human nature. He was young, relatively new to the force, but he had a sharp mind and a keen sense of justice. Miss Marple watched him for a moment, noticing how his eyes swept the room methodically, as though calculating the movements of every individual in the garden. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. The detective had arrived with an agenda. The event's host, the ever-gracious Mrs. Langford, had taken to the stage to announce the evening's festivities, a speech about the significance of the Garden Society in maintaining the beauty and culture of the village. But Miss Marple's attention drifted elsewhere. She couldn't help but feel that there was something slightly off about the gathering tonight. There was an undercurrent she couldn't quite place, like the subtle rustling of leaves before the storm. Just then, a sudden scream pierced the air, slicing through the cheerful ambiance. The crowd froze, as one. Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the source of the sound. It came from the rose garden, where a small cluster of guests had gathered around something, or rather, someone. Without hesitation, Miss Marple began making her way toward the scene, her keen eyes noticing the subtle reactions of those around her. Some people were already moving toward the exit, while others stood frozen in place, as if they were unsure of what to do. She could see Mrs. Smythe's hand trembling slightly as she reached for her fan, and Mr. Fenwick had his hand pressed against his chin, his brow furrowed in thought. As Miss Marple reached the crowd, she could see the shape of a man lying motionless on the ground, his tuxedo jacket undone and his face pale under the flickering light. A pool of dark red spread slowly across the grass. The crowd parted for her as she knelt beside him. It was Charles Radcliffe, a prominent businessman in the village, well known for his sharp deals and equally sharp tongue. He had been one of the most vocal patrons of the Garden Society, frequently sponsoring its events and contributing generously to its coffers. His death was not only a blow to the community, but it also hinted at a deeper, more personal mystery. "Miss Marple," said Hughes, his voice steady, but his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. "I didn't expect you here." "Neither did I," Miss Marple replied, glancing up at him with a knowing smile. "But here we are." She took in the scene before her. Charles Radcliffe's body was still warm, his hand stretched out as if he had reached for something, or perhaps someone, before he had fallen. There was no sign of struggle, but that did not rule out foul play. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, already piecing together fragments of what she had seen and heard in the past hour. The ball had been full of well-meaning smiles and pleasant exchanges, But someone here had something to hide, and they had made the grave mistake of bringing their secrets to this garden. "I'll need to ask everyone to remain where they are until the investigation is concluded," Hughes said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "But of course," Miss Marple said, rising to her feet. She turned to Hughes, her eyes sharp with clarity. "But before you make any decisions, Inspector, I suggest you look at who left the scene first." Hughes raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking around the gathering. "You think someone ran?" "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "But someone might have walked away with something they didn't intend to leave behind." As she spoke, she noticed Lady Hargrove, her eyes darting nervously as she whispered something to her companion. Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if the lady had been a bit too eager to join the group near the entrance when the body had been discovered. The pieces were falling into place, but she knew that a few more observations were necessary before the true picture could emerge. The crowd, once lively and filled with laughter, now felt heavy with suspicion. The ball had become a quiet, tense affair, each guest no longer merely an attendee but a potential suspect. The garden, once a place of beauty, had turned into a stage for a grim drama, and Miss Marple had every intention of seeing it to its final act. She stood back for a moment, letting the scene settle into her mind. It was clear that the death of Charles Radcliffe was no accident. The questions that followed would be the ones that revealed the true nature of the people she had known for years, and Miss Marple had a unique way of asking the right questions, the kind of questions that would force even the most tight-lipped to speak their truth. As the moonlight bathed the garden in an eerie glow, Miss Marple couldn't help but smile. This, she thought, was where her work truly began. The garden had fallen silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. The guests were scattered in small, uneasy clusters, their whispered conversations tinged with suspicion. Miss Marple, ever observant, stood by the rose bushes, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd, noting the subtle movements of those around her. Inspector Hughes had already started questioning the nearest witnesses, but Miss Marple wasn't concerned with the words they spoke. It was the things left unsaid that often revealed the most. Lady Hargrove had positioned herself near the entrance to the garden, her hand clutching her shawl tightly as she exchanged glances with her husband. Her face, usually a mask of composed grace, was now flushed, her eyes darting nervously across the crowd. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in Lady Hargrove's fingers as they lingered over the edge of her glass, the unease in her posture betraying a woman who was no longer in control of the situation. The good lady had been standing with Radcliffe earlier, hadn't she? Miss Marple couldn't quite remember, but the scene was beginning to take shape. The first to approach her, however, was Mrs. Smythe, the village matriarch. Her perfectly coiffed hair and impeccable dress made her seem an island of poise amidst the chaos. But even she couldn't hide the tension in her movements as she came to stand beside Miss Marple. "Such a dreadful thing, isn't it?" Mrs. Smythe said, her voice hushed, though the undercurrent of curiosity and a touch of satisfaction was hard to miss. "Poor Mr. Radcliffe, always the life of the party. And now, we must see what this will bring. His passing, I'm certain, will have far-reaching consequences." Miss Marple turned her head just enough to meet Mrs. Smythe's eyes. The older woman's gaze was cold, calculating as though she was already weighing the political fallout of Radcliffe's death. The matriarch's words were framed in the usual social niceties, but there was something in the way she spoke of Radcliffe's passing that made Miss Marple pause. She wasn't mourning, she was speculating. "You think someone meant to harm him?" Miss Marple asked, her voice light, a mere suggestion of interest. Mrs. Smythe smiled thinly, her lips pressed tightly together. "Oh, I'm not one to speculate about such things, but—" She trailed off, glancing toward the center of the garden. "But I do wonder what secrets that man was hiding. He was a man with many dealings and not all of them above board. But I'm sure you'll uncover the truth soon enough, won't you, Miss Marple?" Before Miss Marple could respond, There was a shift in the crowd. Inspector Hughes, who had been conversing with several of the guests, now approached with a grim expression. His eyes met Miss Marple's for a moment, and she could see the frustration written on his face. It wasn't a look he often wore. He was a man who preferred order, who liked to have his answers neatly packaged. But this was something far messier than he was used to. "I've spoken to most of the guests," he said, his voice low. "No one saw anything out of the ordinary before the scream. There are a few who claim they heard a noise, a thud perhaps, just moments before, but none of them seem certain. There's no sign of a struggle, no weapons, nothing to suggest who might have done this." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her fingers tapping gently against the stem of her glass. "How very typical," she murmured, more to herself than to Hughes. "The perfect crime. A well-planned death, carefully staged to leave no trace." Hughes glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "You think this was planned?" "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her eyes sweeping over the crowd once more. "A man like Radcliffe wouldn't be killed on a whim. No, this is something much more deliberate. He wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Hughes opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a sharp voice from across the garden. It was Mr. Fenwick, the solicitor, speaking to a small group of guests. His face was flushed, his hands gesturing wildly as he spoke. "I don't understand it," he was saying, his voice raised above the murmurs. "Radcliffe had no enemies. Not like that. He was a businessman, yes, but always polite. Always—" "He had plenty of enemies," Mrs. Smythe interrupted, her voice cutting through the conversation like a knife. "Just because a man is polite doesn't mean he doesn't make enemies, Mr. Fenwick. Perhaps you should be careful with your assumptions." Fenwick looked flustered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just, well, this seems so sudden, doesn't it?" It was then that Miss Marple's eyes landed on something unusual. A small glint of silver under the light of the lanterns near the edge of the rose garden. She excused herself from Hughes and moved toward it, the crowd parting for her as she went. As she knelt beside the bushes, her fingers brushed over the object, revealing a small pocket watch, its surface scratched and worn, but its hands still ticking. It wasn't Radcliffe's. She was sure of it. Radcliffe had never been one for accessories. He had always been more concerned with making a statement through his actions rather than through outward adornment. This watch, however, was different. It was old, its craftsmanship too fine to be something one might purchase casually. It belonged to someone else. Miss Marple stood, pocketing the watch, her mind already racing. Who had dropped it? And why? She turned back toward the gathering, her thoughts sharpening. Someone here knew more than they were letting on. Someone had been careless, and Miss Marple intended to find out exactly who. The game had just begun, and Miss Marple, as always, was ready to play. The evening had grown colder as the hours slipped by, and the once lively garden now seemed eerily quiet. The laughter and music that had filled the air had been replaced by an unsettling stillness. The guests, still gathered in small, uncertain groups, spoke in hushed tones, their eyes glancing toward the spot where Charles Radcliffe had fallen. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the garden, watching the proceedings with a calm, measured gaze. She knew better than to rush into conclusions, no matter how tempting the pieces of the puzzle seemed to be. Patience was always her ally, and in situations like this, the truth would reveal itself when the time was right. She had spoken with Hughes briefly, but he had little to offer. His usual confidence had been shaken, though he would never admit it. He had questioned several of the guests, but no one had seen anything conclusive. They had all been too absorbed in the festivities, too caught up in their own little worlds to notice anything unusual. It was a familiar story in a village like this. People so absorbed in their own lives that they failed to see the threads that connected them all. Miss Marple's attention turned to the pocket watch she had found earlier. It was small, its design elegant but worn, with an engraving on the back that read, "For Thomas, from Clara, 1897. It was an old watch, and not something one would simply discard. Someone had dropped it, and that someone was hiding something. Her mind raced as she thought about the people who had been closest to Radcliffe. Lady Hargrove, with her tightly controlled demeanor. Mrs. Smythe, always so prim and proper, yet with a sharpness that could cut through any situation. And then, of course, Mr. Fenwick, the solicitor with his quick tongue and his tendency to speak before thinking. Any of them could have been involved, but who? As Miss Marple pondered this, she noticed a familiar figure moving toward the garden's exit. Lady Hargrove, her face drawn and pale, her steps brisk and purposeful. Miss Marple had already taken note of the way the lady had kept to herself earlier in the evening, standing at the edges of the conversation, her eyes flickering from one person to another, never quite engaging fully. She had been watching, assessing, calculating. Without hesitation, Miss Marple moved toward her, her feet barely making a sound as she crossed the gravel path. She had learned long ago that the art of conversation was a delicate thing, one that required more listening than speaking. As she approached Lady Hargrove, she allowed the silence to hang in the air for a moment before speaking. "Such a shame, isn't it?" Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear. Lady Hargrove turned slowly, her eyes wide with a flash of surprise, as though she had not expected anyone to approach her at that particular moment. "Yes," she said slowly, her voice tight. "A terrible tragedy. I'm sure we'll all feel the loss of Mr. Radcliffe deeply." "I'm sure we will," Miss Marple replied, her gaze steady. "But I can't help but wonder, what were you doing just before the scream?" Lady Hargrove's composure faltered, just for an instant, but she quickly regained her poise. She paused, her lips pressing together as though she were searching for the right words. "I was simply admiring the roses. The garden looks so lovely at night, don't you think?" Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes never left Lady Hargrove's face. "Yes, it does. But you didn't see anyone near Mr. Radcliffe. You didn't hear anything unusual?" Lady Hargrove's gaze shifted to the ground, her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag. "No, I didn't. I'm afraid I didn't hear anything at all. I was just..." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, her eyes scanning the garden nervously. Miss Marple studied her for a moment longer before nodding. "Of course, it's just that you seem tense, as though something is troubling you." Lady Hargrove straightened, her back stiffening. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I'm perfectly fine. I've simply had a long evening, and I'm ready to go home." "Of course," Miss Marple said again, her tone gentle. "I'm sure you're tired. But before you go, might I ask you one last question?" Lady Hargrove paused, her expression guarded. "What is it?" "Do you recognize this watch?" Miss Marple held out the small silver timepiece, its surface reflecting the dim light from the lanterns. Lady Hargrove's face drained of color as she stared at the watch. For a long moment she didn't speak, her mouth opening and closing as though she were trying to find the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and shaky. That's Thomas's watch," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how it got here." Miss Marple's eyes never left Lady Hargrove's face. "Thomas?" Lady Hargrove's lips trembled and she took a step back. "My brother. But he died years ago." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind racing as she processed the information. Lady Hargrove had a brother named Thomas, someone she had lost long ago. But why was his watch here now, at the scene of Radcliffe's death? And why had Lady Hargrove reacted the way she did when she saw it? "I'm sorry for your loss," Miss Marple said softly, her tone carefully neutral. "But I must ask, why would your brother's watch be here at this particular moment?" Lady Hargrove looked around the garden as though searching for something, her gaze darting to the nearby trees, to the distant figure of Mr. Fenwick speaking with Mrs. Smythe. I don't know," she whispered, her voice strained. "I don't know, Miss Marple, but I think we're all caught up in something much darker than any of us realize." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Miss Marple watched as Lady Hargrove turned and hurried off toward the exit, her steps quick and purposeful. The watch in Miss Marple's hand felt heavier now, its mystery deepening with every passing second. Something about this was not right. Something was being hidden. And Miss Marple had a feeling that the key to unlocking the truth lay with Lady Hargrove's lost brother, Thomas. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. The garden held more secrets than it appeared, and she would uncover them all, one by one. The night had grown quieter still, the murmurs of the guests now soft and distant, as though the garden itself had become a place suspended in time. The shadows cast by the lanterns stretched long across the cobblestone paths, making the atmosphere feel both intimate and unnerving. Miss Marple, though accustomed to the many layers of human nature, couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, something beneath the surface that no one was willing to admit. She turned her attention back to the watch she had found earlier. It weighed heavily in her pocket, as though urging her to unravel its significance. The engraving, "For Thomas," from Clara, 1897, still haunted her thoughts. The watch had been dropped by someone in a hurry. But why? What connection did this Thomas have to Charles Radcliffe, the man who had been found lifeless on the garden path? It was clear now that the events of the night were more intricately linked than anyone had realized. The more Miss Marple thought, the more she realized how little she actually knew about Radcliffe. He was a businessman, but beyond that, he remained something of a mystery to most. Those who had spoken of him earlier, Lady Hargrove, Mrs. Smythe, and even Mr. Fenwick, had all spoken in vague terms. They knew him, of course, but no one had really seemed to know him. It was as though he were a figure of importance, yes, but one whose personal life remained largely shrouded. The lack of details was troubling. There were too many things unsaid. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden appearance of Mrs. Smythe, moving briskly toward her with a purpose. The matriarch's face was set in a stern, almost accusatory expression, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity, as though she were weighing something in her mind. She stopped just short of Miss Marple, glancing around the garden, and then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Smythe began, "I must apologize for my earlier behavior. I know I was sharp with you, but—" She hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "I've been thinking, and I believe we're all overlooking something very important." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Her interest piqued. "Go on." "There's more to Charles Radcliffe than anyone has said, more than we've let on," Mrs. Smythe continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I know you've been poking around, asking questions. I've heard things, Miss Marple. Things about him, things that could explain why someone might want him gone." "Such as?" Miss Marple prompted, her tone calm but insistent. Mrs. Smythe glanced over her shoulder before taking a step closer, her voice dropping even further. "I believe Radcliffe was not as well liked as he appeared. In fact, I've heard whispers about a falling out he had with someone close to him. A business deal gone wrong, perhaps. But it's not just that. I've heard rumors about his involvement with a certain woman. A woman he was seen with only days before the ball. Clara. She was from a family of some repute, but I've never understood why she would be involved with someone like Radcliffe." Miss Marple listened intently, her thoughts racing as she tried to piece together the scattered fragments of information. The mention of Clara, the name from the engraving on the watch, sent a jolt of recognition through her. The connections were beginning to form, albeit slowly. But there were still gaps. So many gaps. "What sort of rumors are we talking about?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady. Mrs. Smythe hesitated, then spoke again, her voice tight with the weight of what she was saying. "I can't say much for certain, but there was talk that Radcliffe had made enemies in both business and in his personal life. There were whispers of betrayal, lies, and greed. Then, Clara." Mrs. Smythe stopped, swallowing hard. I don't know if she was a lover or something else entirely, but it's clear she had a strong hold on him, perhaps more than anyone realized. Miss Marple processed the information carefully. Clara, the woman's name, had now surfaced twice in the span of minutes. And now, the hints of betrayal, dishonesty, and tangled personal relationships painted a clearer picture of Radcliffe's life. One that had been far from perfect, far from the facade of civility that the Garden Society had believed. And where did this Clara come from? Miss Marple asked, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Smythe's face. She came from nowhere, really, Mrs. Smythe replied, shaking her head. She wasn't from a family of wealth or standing, not like some of us. Her connections were murky, if you ask me. But she had a way with people, a way of making things happen. And Radcliffe, for all his faults, was a man who liked power. I suspect she was more than just a pretty face to him. She had something on him, something he couldn't afford to lose. The more Miss Marple listened, the more certain she became that there was a deeper connection between Radcliffe's death and the people closest to him. This Clara, whoever she was, had become the key. If only she could uncover who she really was and why Radcliffe had felt compelled to protect her secrets. "You've given me much to think about, Mrs. Smythe," Miss Marple said finally, her voice soft but determined. "But I wonder, why would you tell me this now? What do you hope to gain?" Mrs. Smythe stiffened at the question, her eyes darting nervously. "Nothing, Miss Marple. I only want what's best for this village, for all of us. I thought you might be able to help, but perhaps I was wrong. You've been quite persistent." Miss Marple smiled, though there was little warmth in it. "I'm always persistent, Mrs. Smythe. It is one of my few virtues." Mrs. Smythe, clearly uncomfortable, shifted on her feet. "Well then, I've said my piece. I trust you'll take it into account." With that, she turned on her heel and walked briskly back toward the cluster of guests near the garden's edge. Miss Marple stood for a moment longer, her mind processing what had been said. She had no doubt that Mrs. Smythe had her own reasons for speaking up, reasons that were far from altruistic. But that didn't matter. What mattered now was the puzzle, the threads of betrayal and deceit that were beginning to unravel before her. The game was growing more complex, but Miss Marple knew she was getting closer to the truth, and the truth, she was certain, would not be what anyone expected. The night deepened around the garden, the cool air now thick with the weight of unspoken truth. The lanterns, once bright and lively, flickered like distant stars as the guests began to gather in tighter clusters. They no longer spoke with the carefree tones of before, their conversations now measured and careful, their eyes darting nervously from one another. The abrupt death of Charles Radcliffe had cast a shadow over the evening, and it seemed no one was willing to address it directly. Miss Marple, however, knew that it was precisely in the silences that the truth would be found. She stood on the fringes of the crowd, her hands folded neatly in front of her, observing the subtle shifts in posture and expression that spoke volumes more than the words being exchanged. Mrs. Smythe's whispered confession had only deepened the mystery. Clara, the elusive woman tied to Radcliffe in ways Miss Marple had yet to fully understand, had become central to the investigation. But despite the hints and the fragmentary details, there was something else gnawing at Miss Marple's mind, something that seemed just beyond her grasp. She needed more information, and she needed it fast. Her attention was drawn to a soft rustling nearby. It was Mr. Fenwick, the solicitor, his face flushed, his eyes darting toward the exit. His earlier assurances that Radcliffe was well liked now seemed hollow in the wake of the murder. Miss Marple had noticed how quickly he had retreated into the shadows when the police began their inquiries. There was something about him, something calculating, perhaps, or defensive. She couldn't decide yet, but it was clear that Fenwick had an agenda of his own. He was speaking with a few others now, his voice low, yet unmistakable in the hushed air. He was agitated, his gestures sharp as he leaned in closer to his companions. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to study him. Fenwick was not one to show his cards easily. He had the demeanor of a man who understood the value of appearances, how to play his part and keep his secrets well guarded. But there was something he was hiding, and it wasn't just a business deal gone wrong, as Mrs. Smythe had hinted. She decided to approach him, her footsteps silent on the gravel path. As she drew closer, Fenwick's gaze shifted toward her, and for a brief moment his face stiffened, then softened into something that barely passed for a smile. "Miss Marple," he said with a slight bow, "I must admit, I wasn't expecting to see you here tonight. Quite the tragic affair, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "Yes, quite tragic. And yet, it seems that some of us may be a little too concerned with appearances tonight, don't you think?" Fenwick's smile faltered just for an instant before he regained his composure. "Appearances? I assure you, I'm merely concerned for the well-being of the village. It's a blow to us all, losing someone like Radcliffe." He paused, his gaze flicking toward the center of the garden where the body had been found. "But of course, the truth will come out. It always does, doesn't it?" Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Indeed. The truth always has a way of making itself known, no matter how deeply it's buried." Fenwick shifted uneasily on his feet, his hands clenched at his sides. "I'm sure you're just as eager as everyone else to know what happened. But we must be patient. These things take time. I've always found that time has a way of revealing the most interesting details," Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself. "Take the pocket watch, for instance. Have you seen it, Mr. Fenwick?" The solicitor's expression didn't change, but there was a slight tightening around his eyes, a flicker of recognition that Miss Marple did not miss. He had known about the watch. He had seen it before. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean," Fenwick said quickly, his voice too smooth, too practiced. "I'm sure I haven't seen it. But if you've found something—" "I've found more than just a watch," Miss Marple interrupted gently, her voice unwavering. "I found a connection between Radcliffe, Clara, and a certain individual who seems to be going to great lengths to keep his own hands clean. A connection I suspect you're very familiar with." Fenwick's gaze faltered for just a moment, but it was enough to confirm Miss Marple's suspicions. He knew more than he was letting on. There was no doubt in her mind now that he was involved, whether directly or indirectly. But what exactly was his role in all of this? And how did he tie into the mysterious Clara? Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the tension between them. It was Hughes, the young detective inspector, his expression unreadable as he glanced at both Miss Marple and Fenwick. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you both to come with me," Hughes said, his tone polite but firm. "There are some matters I need to clarify, and I'd appreciate it if you'd both cooperate." Miss Marple took a step back, her eyes still on Fenwick. "Of course, Inspector. I'm sure we both have much to contribute to your investigation." Fenwick's face tightened, but he said nothing, following Hughes without a word. As the three of them made their way toward the small private area where the inspector had set up his temporary office, Miss Marple's mind raced. She knew that the web of lies and half-truths was beginning to unravel. Fenwick's discomfort was only the tip of the iceberg, and there was still so much more to uncover. The garden, once a place of beauty and celebration, had become the backdrop for a dark mystery, and Miss Marple was determined to see it through to the end. She could feel the pieces falling into place, each conversation, each moment guiding her toward the truth. And though the night had cast its long shadow over the ball, Miss Marple knew that dawn would soon break, revealing the full extent of the secrets hidden within the garden's walls. The air was thick with tension as Miss Marple entered the small makeshift office Hughes had set up in the far corner of the garden. It was a stark contrast to the festive atmosphere that had surrounded the ball earlier in the evening. Now the only sounds were the rustling of papers and the occasional cough or muttered remark. The inspector had already spoken to several guests. The mood had shifted from one of curiosity to quiet suspicion. Hughes gestured for Miss Marple to sit, his posture rigid. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced with the unmistakable signs of strain. Miss Marple, ever the observer, noticed the way his eyes darted toward Fenwick, who stood by the window, looking out into the dark garden. His fingers drummed nervously against the glass, and though his back was turned, Miss Marple could sense the unease radiating off him. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming," Hughes said, his voice steady but his gaze betraying the weariness of the night. "I need to ask you a few more questions about your findings. Your observations could be critical in this investigation." "I'm sure you have plenty of questions, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her tone polite but tinged with an air of quiet certainty. "But perhaps we can skip the formalities. You already know I don't miss much." Hughes didn't smile, but he nodded. "I'm aware. That's why I've asked you here. You've been quite sharp in your observations tonight, and it seems you've already uncovered more than we have." Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward Fenwick, still standing by the window, his gaze distant and guarded. "I don't know about that, Inspector, but I do believe there's more going on here than anyone is willing to admit. More than just a simple murder." Hughes leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him, his brow furrowing in thought. "You're saying it wasn't just a random act, then?" Miss Marple's eyes never left Fenwick's back. "No, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. And the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that Charles Radcliffe wasn't simply a victim of circumstance. Someone wanted him dead, and they made sure it would happen tonight." There was a brief silence, the weight of Miss Marple's words hanging heavily in the air. Hughes glanced at Fenwick as though measuring his reaction before turning back to Miss Marple. "You have a theory, then? A suspect?" he asked, his voice low. Miss Marple hesitated before replying. "I'm not ready to point fingers just yet, Inspector, but I do believe we should start with the people closest to Radcliffe: Lady Hargrove, Mrs. Smythe, and, of course, Mr. Fenwick." Hughes raised an eyebrow at the mention of Fenwick's name. "You think Fenwick is involved?" "I think Fenwick is hiding something," Miss Marple said simply. "There's a certain defensiveness about him, a sense of urgency when he speaks. And I noticed something earlier, something very telling. When I mentioned the watch, he knew exactly what I was talking about. That watch, Inspector, it doesn't belong to Radcliffe. It's an old family heirloom, and Fenwick knew it the moment he saw it. Why else would he react that way unless he had something to do with it?" Hughes looked thoughtful, rubbing his chin as he processed Miss Marple's words. "You're suggesting that the watch connects Fenwick to Radcliffe's death?" "Not just the watch, but the woman, Clara," Miss Marple replied. "I've been thinking about her ever since Mrs. Smythe mentioned her. She was involved with Radcliffe, that much is clear. But what was her role in all of this? And why did Fenwick seem so uncomfortable when I mentioned her name? There's more to this than we realize." Hughes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "So you believe Clara was the key? That she had some connection to Fenwick?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said. "But I'm not sure of the exact nature of their relationship. What I do know is that Clara's name keeps coming up. Lady Hargrove mentioned her, and Fenwick's reaction to her name was telling. He's not just a bystander in this, Inspector. He's involved in one way or another." There was another pause as Hughes weighed her words. He seemed to be turning the puzzle over in his mind, trying to fit the pieces together. Finally, he spoke again, his voice more uncertain than before. "What do you think Fenwick's motive could be?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was already a few steps ahead. "Motive? I believe Fenwick had something to gain from Radcliffe's death. Perhaps a business deal that went sour. Perhaps Clara was involved in that deal as well. There's something about the way Fenwick speaks of Radcliffe's business practices that doesn't sit right with me. He's been too quick to distance himself from the man, and I suspect he's hiding the truth behind a carefully crafted facade." Hughes nodded slowly, his fingers tapping on the arm of his chair. "That's a theory, certainly. But we need more than just theories. We need proof." Miss Marple smiled, a small, knowing smile. "And that, Inspector, is where I come in." Before Hughes could respond, the door to the makeshift office opened, and one of the officers stepped inside, a manila folder in hand. "Inspector, we've found something you'll want to see," he said, his voice urgent. "It's about Radcliffe's business dealings." Hughes motioned for him to speak. The officer opened the folder and laid out a set of documents on the table in front of them. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes scanning the papers with a sharpness that only someone of her experience could muster. As she read, a quiet excitement stirred within her. The pieces were starting to fit together. Radcliffe had been involved in a number of shady transactions, the officer said, pointing to a few documents, and it looks like Fenwick was named as a potential beneficiary in one of the deals. It seems that Radcliffe had made some promises to him, promises that were never fulfilled. Miss Marple glanced up at Hughes, her eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "There's the motive, Inspector. Fenwick had more than just business dealings with Radcliffe. He had a personal stake in his success. And when that success began to slip away, it seems Fenwick may have taken matters into his own hands." The room was silent for a moment as the weight of the revelation settled over them. Hughes sat back in his chair, his face darkening with the understanding that the investigation was about to take a much more complicated turn. Miss Marple, however, felt only the thrill of the chase. The truth, she knew, was always hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right person to uncover it. And now, with the pieces finally falling into place, she was more certain than ever that the answer was within her grasp. The evening had settled into a tense quiet, the once lively chatter of the ball now replaced by hushed whispers and sidelong glances. Miss Marple had spent the last few hours observing, piecing together fragments of conversation and watching the guests from the corners of the garden. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but there was still much to uncover. It was clear that the death of Charles Radcliffe was not as simple as it first appeared, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that everyone present at the ball had something to hide, from the most respected members of the village to the seemingly inconspicuous guests who had kept to themselves. As she stood near the edge of the garden, her gaze swept over the small group gathered by the fountain where Fenwick had positioned himself. He stood with his arms crossed, a stern expression etched on his face as he spoke with Mrs. Smythe. The matriarch was nodding, her lips pressed tightly together, and Miss Marple noted the way Fenwick seemed to be trying to convince her of something, his tone insistent but not quite pleading. He wasn't used to being questioned, Miss Marple thought, and it was evident that he was trying to maintain control of the situation. But for all his posturing, there was something off about the way he held himself, something that betrayed a deeper concern than he was willing to admit. Miss Marple's attention shifted to Mrs. Smythe, whose usual composure had given way to a visible unease. The older woman was always calculating, always in control, yet tonight she seemed shaken by something. Her eyes darted to the ground as she spoke to Fenwick, her hands wringing nervously in the folds of her gown. It was subtle, but Miss Marple knew enough to recognize it. Mrs. Smythe was no longer entirely confident. There was fear in her posture, and it was not just the fear of being caught in some petty scandal. It was the fear of something darker, something more personal. But what could it be? What was Mrs. Smythe hiding, and why did it make her so uneasy? Miss Marple had spent the last hour reflecting on the words she had overheard earlier, fragments of conversations, carefully crafted remarks, and the whispers of secrets that the guests had tried to bury beneath their polite exteriors. There was no doubt in her mind that Charles Radcliffe had been a man of many faces. He had been a businessman, a philanthropist, a supporter of the village's many causes, but beneath that public image, he had been tangled in webs of deceit. And now, those webs were beginning to unravel, piece by piece. The quiet murmur of voices in the garden intensified as the minutes passed. Miss Marple turned and saw Lady Hargrove approaching the fountain, her heels clicking sharply against the cobblestones. Her posture was stiff, her face a mask of controlled composure, but Miss Marple could see it, the subtle twitch of her hand, the way she clutched her shawl tightly as if to hide something beneath it. It was the same nervousness she had noticed earlier when Lady Hargrove had been speaking with Mrs. Smythe. Something about that conversation had unsettled her, and Miss Marple was beginning to believe that the lady was far more involved in this mystery than she had let on. Lady Hargrove stopped at the fountain and glanced at Fenwick, her eyes narrowing slightly. He looked back at her, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The two exchanged a brief, tense nod before she turned her attention to Mrs. Smythe. The three of them stood together for a moment, speaking in low voices, but Miss Marple could sense that the conversation was more than just casual chatter. There was an undercurrent, a tension that hung in the air, one that Miss Marple had learned to detect with time. She had seen it in other cases before, the way people communicated without words, the way they tried to shield each other from the truth. And then, suddenly, Miss Marple understood. There was no casual connection between Lady Hargrove, Mrs. Smythe, and Fenwick. It wasn't just a matter of small talk or social obligation. These three were tied together by something far deeper, something that involved Radcliffe and his death. The realization hit her with startling clarity. Lady Hargrove had been close to Radcliffe, of that much she was certain. But it wasn't just a friendship. There was something more. Perhaps an affair, perhaps a business arrangement gone awry. And Fenwick, with his evasive manner and his nervous glances, had been involved in it all. Mrs. Smythe, too, she had known more than she was letting on, but she was keeping her cards close to her chest, aware that any wrong move would give away her complicity. But what was their connection to Clara, and why was she so central to this web of deceit? Miss Marple glanced at the darkened edge of the garden where she had noticed a figure standing alone, near the hedgerow. It was Clara. There was no mistaking her. She was watching the group by the fountain, her posture tense, her face unreadable. Clara's presence had been a constant mystery. No one had known much about her, and her sudden disappearance from the conversation was as telling as any confession. She was no longer a mere bystander. She was the key, the thread that tied everything together. Miss Marple moved silently through the crowd, her steps light and deliberate. She approached Clara, who hadn't yet noticed her presence. Clara stood with her back to Miss Marple, her hands clasped in front of her. She was staring out into the dark garden, but her eyes weren't focused on anything in particular. She was lost in thought, perhaps waiting for something, perhaps someone. "Clara," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying just enough to break the silence. Clara stiffened, then slowly turned, her face pale in the dim light. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth but with an edge of surprise. "I didn't realize you were there." "I've been watching," Miss Marple replied, her gaze unwavering. "And I believe you've been watching too. Watching them, watching me, watching everything." Clara's eyes flickered with a trace of something, fear perhaps, or guilt. Miss Marple couldn't be sure. But she knew one thing. Clara knew more than she was letting on, and it was time for the truth to come out. "Why don't we have a little chat, Clara?" Miss Marple said, her tone casual but heavy with meaning. "I think it's time you told me everything you know." Clara's gaze shifted uneasily, the tension in her shoulders evident as she glanced around the garden, as though considering whether to flee or to remain. But she knew she had no choice. Miss Marple's words, though spoken with an air of civility, had a weight to them that made it impossible for Clara to ignore. The old woman had a way of looking through people, a way of unraveling the most tightly wound secrets with a simple question or a subtle observation. Clara had learned that by now, even if she didn't entirely understand how. She let out a soft sigh, a mixture of resignation and something more, perhaps regret or fear. I'm not sure what you think you know, Miss Marple, but I can assure you I don't have much to say. Miss Marple didn't flinch at Clara's reticence. Instead, she watched her with calm, steady eyes. I don't think you're as innocent as you'd like everyone to believe, Clara. There's more to Charles Radcliffe's death than what you've told us. I've been paying attention, and I know you've been trying to avoid the truth. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes briefly flashing with something. Was it frustration? Fear? She wasn't sure which, but Miss Marple had seen it all before. The signs of a person who was close to cracking, close to breaking their own facade. I don't know what you mean, Clara said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I've told you all I know. I barely knew Radcliffe. He was just a man who used to pay you for something, perhaps. Miss Marple's voice cut through her words, sharp and direct. There was no hesitation in her tone now. A man you had a relationship with, beyond the occasional business transaction. Clara stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. The air between them thickened with the unspoken, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire garden had gone silent, holding its breath. Clara's gaze flickered away, her shoulders slumping just enough to show the weight of the truth she was desperately trying to hide. I don't know what you're implying, Clara stammered, her voice growing more erratic, but Miss Marple saw through it. The more Clara spoke, the more the cracks in her carefully constructed facade widened. No, Miss Marple asked, her voice quiet but insistent. You don't know that. Radcliffe was deeply involved in business deals that were far more than just financial, or that those deals were tied to some very dangerous people who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who stood in their way. Clara's face paled, her lips trembling as she took a step back, her fingers twitching by her side. She could no longer pretend she hadn't heard. The game was over, and she knew it. You're wrong, she whispered, almost too softly to hear. He didn't. It wasn't like that. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes unwavering. But it was, wasn't it? You knew about the shady dealings, the lies. You knew the man you had been working with wasn't just a businessman. He was a man in debt to dangerous people, a man who crossed too many lines. And now he's dead. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She closed it again, shaking her head slowly, as if in disbelief of how close Miss Marple was to the truth. But Miss Marple could see it all now, the guilt, the fear, the panic that was threatening to rise to the surface. Clara wasn't a victim here. She had been complicit in something far darker. Tell me, Clara, Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but filled with an undeniable certainty. How much did you know about those debts? About Radcliffe's dealings with Fenwick and the others? Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into the fabric of her dress. Her breath hitched as she fought to hold herself together, but it was clear to Miss Marple that the walls were crumbling around her. I didn't know everything, Clara said, her voice trembling. But I knew enough. I knew Radcliffe had been trying to get out of his dealings. He wanted to pay off his debts, get away from it all. He said he could fix everything. He promised me things, a future, a life away from all of this. Miss Marple nodded, her expression never changing. A life away from the danger, away from the lies. But that wasn't possible, was it? Because Radcliffe had made too many enemies, too many promises he couldn't keep. Clara shook her head, tears beginning to well in her eyes, but she fought them back. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want him dead. Her voice cracked, her chest rising and falling with each shaky breath. He was going to fix things. He was going to make it right, but then everything went wrong. Miss Marple's eyes softened ever so slightly, but she didn't look away. And someone made sure it did, didn't they? Someone saw an opportunity, and they took it. I'm guessing it wasn't just a simple business deal gone bad. I'm guessing it was something more personal. Something you're not telling me." Clara's face twisted in pain as she collapsed against the stone wall of the garden, her shoulders shaking as the weight of her secret pressed down on her. She looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes filled with fear. "I never wanted to be part of this. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But Radcliffe, he didn't understand. He thought he could handle it. He didn't realize how dangerous it all was until it was too late." Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice gentle now. "And Fenwick, what part did he play in all of this?" Clara's gaze flickered with a mixture of fear and something else. Guilt, perhaps. She swallowed hard before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fenwick, he had more to gain from Radcliffe's death than anyone. He was tied to it all more than he let on. And I was just caught in the middle." The confession hung in the air between them, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already turning over the implications of what Clara had just revealed. This wasn't just about a business deal gone wrong. This was about a web of lies, deceit, and betrayal, ties that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. Clara had finally broken. She had finally told Miss Marple the truth, but Miss Marple knew this was only the beginning. Now, the true story would begin to unfold, piece by piece. The garden was still, save for the soft rustling of leaves stirred by the evening breeze and the occasional murmur of conversation from the few remaining guests. The night had grown heavy with the weight of secrets, and the once beautiful garden now felt more like a stage set for a tragedy. Miss Marple had watched it all unfold, every lie, every half-truth. And now, with Clara's confession still lingering in the air, she was closer than ever to the truth. Clara had admitted to her involvement, but there was more to the story, much more. Fenwick's role, the debts, the connections that tied everything together. Miss Marple could feel the web tightening around them. She needed to piece it together to understand the full scope of the tragedy before it slipped through her fingers. As the night wore on, the guests who had not yet left the ball gathered in groups near the fountain or under the canopy of trees, exchanging nervous glances and hushed words. The tension in the air was palpable, and Miss Marple knew that the longer she waited, the harder it would be to get the final pieces of the puzzle. She turned toward the small path leading back toward the main house. Hughes was standing near the door, speaking with a few of the officers. The detective inspector's face was drawn, his shoulders tight with the strain of the evening's events. Miss Marple approached him, her steps deliberate, and as she neared, he looked up, his tired eyes meeting hers. "You've been busy, Miss Marple," Hughes said quietly, his voice betraying the exhaustion he was trying to hide. "I'm sure you've learned more than I have tonight." She gave him a small smile, though it was tinged with the recognition of how far they still had to go. "I've learned enough to know that there's more to this than anyone is saying. But we're close, Inspector. I'm certain of it." Hughes glanced over his shoulder toward Fenwick, who was speaking with Lady Hargrove and Mrs. Smythe near the garden entrance. He was standing tall, his usual air of confidence restored, but there was something else in his expression. A flicker of unease, as if he knew his time was running out. "I don't think any of us are saying enough," Hughes replied, his tone quiet but firm. "Fenwick's been acting strangely, and the things we've uncovered, Radcliffe's business dealings, the debts, the other names involved, none of it's adding up. There's something they're hiding, something bigger than we realize." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving Fenwick's back. "I believe you're right, Inspector. It's always the quiet ones, isn't it? They think they can slip under the radar, but they never realize how much people like me are watching. It's the smallest things that give them away." Hughes turned back to her, his brow furrowing. "So, what's next? You think Fenwick is behind this? You think he killed Radcliffe?" Miss Marple's gaze flickered briefly to Clara, who was still standing near the hedge, her eyes downcast, lost in thought. I don't believe Fenwick acted alone. In fact, I'm almost certain that Clara had more to do with Radcliffe's death than she's let on. Hughes gave her a skeptical look. Clara. She doesn't seem capable of murder. She's been upset, yes, but I wouldn't put her at the center of it. No, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but firm. Clara didn't kill Radcliffe, not directly. But she was involved, and I suspect that she knew more than she's admitted. She knew about the debts, about the shady dealings, and about Fenwick's involvement. But more than that, she knew that Radcliffe had become a liability, and in a situation like that, people like her, people with their own agendas, don't wait for things to resolve themselves. They take action. She took action. Hughes was silent for a moment, his gaze following Miss Marple's as she observed Clara. Finally, he spoke, his voice tinged with disbelief. So you think she was the one who tipped Fenwick off? Told him about Radcliffe's plans, or worse? She helped him push Radcliffe toward the people who would take care of him? Exactly, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. Clara was in the right place at the right time, and she knew exactly how to play the game. But she didn't just sit back. She wanted something from Radcliffe, just as Fenwick did, and I believe she was willing to go to any lengths to get it. Hughes looked at her, his expression more thoughtful now, as though he was beginning to see the pieces fall into place. And Fenwick? You still think he's the one who killed Radcliffe? I'm not sure, Miss Marple said slowly. But I do believe Fenwick is the one who arranged it. He's the one who stands to gain the most. He's been trying to cover his tracks ever since he realized Radcliffe was going to expose him, but he needed help. Someone who could get close to Radcliffe, someone who could manipulate him. Clara fit that role perfectly. Hughes let out a breath, his shoulders slumping slightly as the weight of the investigation bore down on him. This is all coming together too slowly for my liking. We need to act before they disappear, or worse, start covering their tracks. Miss Marple gave a small nod. We will, Inspector, but we need one more thing to seal it. The final piece of the puzzle. Fenwick's connection to Clara. The watch. There's something there. Something they don't want us to know. Hugh's eyes widened in realization, and he took a step toward her. The watch, of course. That's the one thing they haven't been able to explain. If we can connect Fenwick to the watch, it will tie everything together. Exactly, Miss Marple said, a slight smile tugging at her lips. Now we just need to find out how Fenwick came into possession of it. He can't hide the truth forever. As the night pressed on, Miss Marple and Hughes stood together, silently watching the remaining guests, the weight of their shared understanding heavy in the air. They were close now, closer than ever. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, and soon the truth would come out. And when it did, nothing would be the same again. The night had deepened into an almost suffocating silence, the kind that seemed to press against the walls of the garden and the minds of those still present. The guests, who had once been animated by laughter and conversation, were now reduced to quiet murmurs and uncertain glances. Miss Marple, standing in the shadow of the old oak tree, observed them all with a calm intensity. She had watched the evening unfold, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the faint tremors of nervousness, and the careful way people avoided each other's eyes. The puzzle was almost complete now. She had connected the dots. Every clue had led her here, to this moment. Charles Radcliffe's death had been no accident, and it had been no simple business deal gone wrong. There were deeper layers, darker motivations that ran through every conversation, every hidden glance, and now it was time to expose the truth. Miss Marple glanced once more at the small group near the fountain. Fenwick stood with Lady Hargrove and Mrs. Smythe, speaking in hushed tones, but their nervous energy was palpable. The faintest flicker of guilt crossed Fenwick's face as he caught her eye for a brief moment, but he quickly masked it with a practiced, neutral expression. He was used to controlling the narrative, to bending situations to his will. But Miss Marple had seen through him. She had seen through them all. She turned her attention to Hughes, who stood a few feet away, speaking with an officer in quiet tones. His face was grim, his exhaustion visible, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something that matched the quiet determination Miss Marple had seen in herself for years. It was the understanding that the final piece of the puzzle was within reach, and that the answers would soon be laid bare. "Inspector," Miss Marple called softly, her voice cutting through the murmur of the garden. Hughes looked up, his brow furrowing slightly as he approached her. "We're nearly there, Miss Marple," he said, his tone low but filled with resolve. "You've been right all along. Fenwick and Clara, both of them are hiding something, but we need to bring it all together. We need the final piece." Miss Marple smiled faintly, the lines around her eyes softening. "We have it, Inspector. It's all here. The watch, the debts, the betrayal. It's all connected." Hughes raised an eyebrow. "The watch? But you said—" "The watch is the key," Miss Marple interjected, her voice firm. "It's not just a trinket, Inspector. It's a message, a symbol of the ties that bind." Fenwick wasn't just a bystander in this. He knew exactly what was happening, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. Hughes stared at her, processing the words. His gaze flickered over to Fenwick, who had turned his back to them, still talking to Mrs. Smythe. So, Fenwick. He was the one who arranged it all. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Fenwick. Not entirely. Clara played her part too. But Fenwick, he's the one who had the most to gain. He needed Radcliffe gone. He needed the control that Radcliffe's death would bring. Hughes let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. But why the watch? Why would Clara drop it? Miss Marple's smile was small, but knowing. It wasn't dropped by accident, Inspector. It was dropped by Clara deliberately. She wanted someone to find it. She wanted to leave a clue. A clue that would lead us straight to Fenwick. Hughes blinked in realization. "You're saying she wanted us to find it?" "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. Clara knew that Radcliffe was dead, and she knew that Fenwick would try to cover his tracks, but she didn't want to go down with him. She was trying to distance herself, to give us a thread to pull on. She thought the watch would implicate Fenwick. And it did. Hughes looked toward Fenwick once more, his eyes narrowing. "So, we've got him. It's all falling apart for him." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Not quite yet, Inspector. There's still one more thing we need to uncover. Fenwick's connection to Clara, and how deeply involved he truly was." With a knowing glance, Miss Marple turned back toward the group near the fountain. She saw Lady Hargrove's face, pale and drawn, her eyes flicking nervously between Fenwick and the others. Mrs. Smythe, too, seemed tense, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she spoke to Fenwick. The pieces were in place, but there was something missing, something that needed to be said aloud to tie it all together. "Let's bring them all together, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly. "It's time they all knew the truth." Hughes nodded, his eyes focused. "Right. We'll need to get everyone in the same room. Make sure they can't hide anymore." Within moments, the guests were gathered, standing in a tense circle around Miss Marple and Hughes. Fenwick, Lady Hargrove, Mrs. Smythe, and Clara, all of them were present. Miss Marple took a deep breath, letting the silence settle before she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice cutting through the tension, "tonight we've uncovered the truth behind the death of Charles Radcliffe. I've spent the evening piecing together the clues, and now it's time to bring everything into the light." Clara's eyes widened, but she remained silent, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. Fenwick, ever the picture of composure, stood with his back straight, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. Lady Hargrove and Mrs. Smythe exchanged nervous glances, but neither of them spoke. Miss Marple continued. "It wasn't just business that drove Radcliffe's death. It was greed, betrayal, and the desire for power. Fenwick and Clara were both involved. Fenwick, you were deeply in debt to Radcliffe. You thought that his death would free you from the consequences of your actions. But Clara knew about it all. She knew that Radcliffe was on the verge of exposing the truth about your dealings. There was a collective gasp from the group. Fenwick's face tightened, but he didn't speak. Clara, however, looked down, her face flushed with shame. You both knew, Miss Marple said softly. But in the end, it wasn't just about the money. It was about control, about taking what wasn't yours and protecting yourselves from the consequences of your greed. The silence that followed was heavy, each word hanging in the air like a final verdict. Clara's head sank lower, and Fenwick's expression crumbled into one of defeat. Miss Marple had done it. She had unraveled the mystery, exposed the lies, and brought the truth to the surface. And as the first light of dawn began to break over the garden, Miss Marple knew that justice would be served.